Hi, Aqua Roomers. It's time for a story. Today we're reading The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. And you're going to notice in this book, all of the illustrations are brown except for the quilt. And, the people look a little different in this picture. The author is writing about her family generations ago. And the family came from Russia. I'm going to show you that, right? Our big map book. We haven't looked at this in a while. Whoa. So, here is the whole world, right? And that's where we are. Go across the Atlantic Ocean and Russia. Oh my goodness, my arm doesn't even reach. All across the top here. It's a huge place. It's a little different now, but it was bigger, and that is where the family history starts. So today the country is broken up into other countries, but back then, big country, Russia. But also, if it's called the Keeping Quilt, I wanted to show you Gloria's quilt. Something you may not know. You know how much she loves this. She calls this her peace quilt. But do you see on the front, do you ever notice all of the different squares? This is called a patchwork quilt. And what used to happen is that when clothing wore out, nobody threw anything away, you would take the cloth, cut squares of the parts that were still okay, and use that to make a quilt. And Gloria's quilt is made from patches that the Aqua Roomers loved years ago. So, think about that when you hear the story. The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. Ooh, oh my goodness. Now this is important. Look at all of these people. They're on a ship. And they're sailing to America. You know how I know that's America? That is the Statue of Liberty. Yes. And do you see? This is where the story begins. When my great-grandma Anna came to America, she wore the same thick overcoat and big boots she had worn for farm work. But her family weren't dirt farmers anymore. In New York City, her father's work was hauling things on a wagon, and the rest of the family made artificial flowers all day long. Lots of people. Everyone was in a hurry, and it was so crowded. Not like in back home Russia, but all the same, it was their home, and most of their neighbors were just like them. When Anna went to school, English sounded to her like pebbles dropping into shallow water. Shh, shh. In 6 months, she was speaking English. Her parents almost never learned, so she spoke English for them. The only things she had left of her back home Russia were her dress And the babushka she liked to throw up in the air when she was dancing. So a babushka is a cloth, it's like a giant scarf that people would wear on their head, over their shoulders, and that's all she had left. And her dress was getting too small. After her mother had sewn her a new one, she took her old dress and babushka. Then from a basket of old clothes, she took Uncle Vladimir's shirt, Aunt Javelina's nightdress, and an apron of Aunt Natasha's. We will make a quilt to help us always remember home, Anna's mother said. It will be like having the family in back home Russia dance around us at night. So just like Gloria's quilt, she's going to take pieces of all of those special pieces of clothing and put them all together in a quilt so they could remember the family back home. Wow. And so it was. Anna's mother invited all the neighborhood ladies. They cut out animals and flowers from the scraps of clothing. Anna kept the needles threaded and handed them to the ladies as they needed them. The border of the quilt was made of Anna's babushka. See? On Friday nights, Anna's mother would say the prayers that started the Sabbath. The family ate challah and chicken soup, and the quilt was their tablecloth. Anna grew up and fell in love with great-grandpa Sasha. To show he wanted to be her husband, he gave Anna a gold coin, a dried flower, and a piece of rock salt, all tied into a linen handkerchief. The gold was for wealth, the flower for love, and the salt so their lives would have flavor. She accepted the hanky. They were engaged. Under the wedding chuppah, Anna and Sasha promised each other love and understanding. After the wedding, the men and women danced separately. Isn't that interesting? Men and women never danced together. Not in Russia, not a long time ago. And see the dancing? The group of women and the group of men. When my grandma Carl was born, Anna wrapped her daughter in the quilt to welcome her warmly into the world. Carly was given a gift of gold, flour, salt, and bread. Gold, so she would never know poverty. A flower, so she would always know love. Salt, so her life would always have flavor. And bread, so that she would never know hunger. And she's wrapped in the quilt. Carly learned to keep the Sabbath and to cook and clean and do washing Married you'll be someday, Anna told Carly. And again, the quilt became the wedding hoopah. This time for Carly's wedding to Grandpa George. Men and women celebrated together, but they still did not dance together. In Carly's wedding, in her bouquet, was a gold coin, bread, and salt. Carly and George moved to a farm in Michigan, and Great-Grandma Anna came to live with them. The quilt, once again, wrapped a new little girl, Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen called Anna Lady Grandma. She had grown very old and was sick a lot. Most of the time, the quilt kept her legs warm. On Anna's 98th birthday, the cake was a Coolidge, a rich cake with raisins and candied fruit on it. Oh. And what is the tablecloth? The quilt. When Great-Grandma Anna died, prayers were said to lift her soul to heaven. My mother, Mary Ellen, was now grown up. When Mary Ellen left home, she took the quilt with her. Do you see it's in the car? Mm-hmm. When she became a bride, the quilt became her huppah. First, for the first time, friends who were not Jews came to the wedding. My mother wore a suit, but in her bouquet were gold, bread, and salt. The quilt welcomed me, Patricia, into the world. And it was the tablecloth for my first birthday party. At night, I would trace my fingers around the edges of each animal on the quilt before I went to sleep. I told my mother stories about the animals on the quilt. She told me whose sleeve had made the horse, whose apron had made the chicken, whose dress had made the flowers, and whose babushka went around the edge of the quilt. The quilt was a pretend cape when I was in the bull ring, or sometimes a tent in the steaming Amazon jungle. At my wedding to Enzo Mario, men and women danced together. In my bouquet were gold, bread, and salt, and a sprinkle of wine, so I would always know laughter. Oh, and there's the quilt. "20 years ago, I held Tracy Denise in the quilt for the first time. Someday she too will leave home and she will take the quilt with her. Isn't that a lovely story? I like that. Gloria likes it too. I've read that to her many, many times. And we've learned about geography. We've learned about Russia. We've learned about a patchwork quilt and generations of families who have come to America. Thank you, Aqua Roomers. Bye.